Hello and welcome to a very short overview of the political history of the era in American history that is known as Reconstruction. This is intended to be a short overview that just sort of hits the main points as we're going through. So, as you'll notice, I will be skipping a lot of the smaller details, and oftentimes, when there's multiple examples of something, I'll only give you one or two of them. So the first thing that we have to understand when we look at Reconstruction is, so what is it? When we talk about Reconstruction, so Reconstruction is reconstructing something, rebuilding something. So what are we rebuilding? Well, specifically, we're rebuilding the major theater of the Civil War, which is the South. By and large, when I say that, what I mean in terms of buildings, bridges, so on and so forth, I'm talking about the Southeast. I'm talking about places like Georgia, South Carolina, to a lesser extent, North Carolina, Virginia, in that sort of a region. States like Georgia and South Carolina were absolutely devastated during the latter stages of the American Civil War. So, first of all, we have to kind of ground ourselves in what is the situation that we're dealing with. So 20% of all Southern white males perished in the war. So right away, we have a real human cost. Southern wealth fell by about 60% between 1860 and 1870. During that exact same time period, Northern wealth grows by 50%. So what you really see is a dramatic shifting in terms of a wealth distribution within the nation. Most of the South was non industrial, it was agricultural. So it was based on cash crop economies, predominantly, of course, cotton, but then to lesser extent, still tobacco, rice, indigo, those sorts of things. It took a long time for these cash crop economies to rebuild. Cotton does not recover to its pre war levels until 1879, tobacco, 1880, sugar, 1893, rice, never. Now, as a result of all of this, there's an enormous amount of resentment in the South towards the North and towards Union soldiers who, as we'll see, will be stationed in the South to try to enforce some of these political objectives of the era of Reconstruction. And then, of course, we have the elephant in the room, which is about 3.5 million human beings went from being property to citizens overnight. That's $3 billion in property lost instantly. Technically, it was actually the value in the enslaved humans that was the largest economic loss to the South. Not the cotton, not the tobacco, not all the cash crops. It was the loss of human capital. That transition is going to be the deciding factor in how the South recovers from the Civil War. We'll see that in just a moment. So there's a variety of different plans for how the South is going to be reconstructed. Abraham Lincoln, in the later stages of the war, had a plan. His was called the 1863 Proclamation of Amnesty. The idea was that Confederate states would be allowed back into the Union when 10% of those who voted in the election of 1860 swore allegiance to the Union. Most Confederates would then also be pardoned. The exception to those would be people who held commissions in the United States Army and rejected those commissions to join the Confederate Army. Those individuals were still by and large seen as traitors to the Union. There would also be exceptions for some of the higher ranking officials in the Confederacy, both in the civil government and in the Army. Those individuals would not be pardoned and or would have to go through extra steps to have themselves be pardoned. Now, the problem with this plan is, of course, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April the 15th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is a titan of American history with an incredibly powerful personality. I don't think there's a lot of historians who doubt the conclusion that had Lincoln lived, something like his plan probably would have been the reality for the South going forward. His death, however, changes things dramatically and not in the way John Wilkes Booth would have intended them to go. So, opposed to Lincoln's plan, we have a group of Republicans in Congress. These are known as the radical Republicans. It's not every Republican, but it's a majority of the Republican Party. And of course, the Republican Party is in firm control of all three branches of government at this point in history because the Democrats, by and large, left the Union with the South. There are still some Northern Democrats, but they're in the minority by and large. And in 1866, in the elections that take place that year, even though it's not a presidential year, a lot of Republicans get elected. And so the Republicans see their majorities go up. The radical Republicans believed that Congress, not the president, should be in charge of Reconstruction. They put forward what was called the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. So before the Civil War is even over, the Republicans in Congress are putting forth this idea of how Reconstruction is going to go. And it's a lot more extreme than President Lincoln had in mind. Under the Wade-Davis Bill, 51% of white male citizens needed to swear loyalty for a state to be readmitted. That's compared to the 10% in Lincoln's plan. So you had to have a lot more. Also, there weren't going to be any broad grants of amnesty. There weren't going to be a lot of pardons that were going to be issued. And the radical Republicans believed that the South needed to be completely transformed. It wasn't going to return to a cash crop based economy with wealthy planters on the top and essentially poor whites and freed African Americans on the bottom, acting in some sort of quasi slave or serf status. That wasn't going to happen. They saw the future of the South as being small, predominantly white farmers earning more subsistence based crops with some cash crops, but not giant plantations anymore. In other words, what the radical Republicans wanted the new South to look like is a lot like what the American West and Midwest was starting to look like in the same era. There are a lot of radical Republicans, but the most important by far is a guy by the name of Thaddeus Stevens, who's from the state of Pennsylvania and who plays a major role in a lot of the affairs to come. One of the things that happens as a result of Reconstruction, and I would go into it in enormous detail if we had the time, but this is supposed to be a brief overview, so I'm going to keep it relatively short here, is that they found what's called the Friedmans Bureau. It has a longer name. It's part of the War Department. But the Friedmans Bureau's goal is to try to help those 3.5 million formerly enslaved people figure out how they're going to live. Because you take all of these individuals and you say, okay, you're free, congratulations. But they don't have any means of supporting themselves. They don't own any property, they don't have any money, they don't have any education by and large. So what are all these individuals going to do? Now, there's a lot of different ways Reconstruction could have gone. And one of the ways Reconstruction could have gone, and many of the radical Republicans wanted to see it go this way, was to take a lot of the land from the wealthy Southern landowners and reapportion it out to the freed peoples of the South. That's not going to happen, but it was one of the things that they wanted to do. So 900 federal agents, it's way too small of a number, were appointed to try to help all these formerly enslaved individuals put some sort of a life together. As you can guess, it's going to be, to say that it's an uphill battle would be the understatement of the millennia. It's going to be extremely difficult. And making matters worse, those 900 agents, and there's far too few of those to begin with, but those 900 individuals find it really difficult to get anything done in the South if they don't have support of Union troops. And that Union troop support is inadequate from the word go. And even when it gets ramped up in later years, it's still not adequate to effect any real change. Now we got to look at the last part of the equation here when it comes to Reconstruction. And that is the person who replaces Abraham Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson. President Andrew Johnson wasn't really ever supposed to be president. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was a Tennessee Democrat. He was a senator from Tennessee. He was the only senator from a state that seceded who stayed in the Union. So Lincoln rewards him for this. He makes him the military governor of Tennessee when Union forces reoccupy the area. And then on top of that, he adds him to the ticket in 1864 as Lincoln's running mate. This is, to a large extent, a way of trying to garner more support for the ticket so that Lincoln is able to successfully win the election, which he does. If you were to ask, what is Andrew Johnson's defining characteristic? It would be his overwhelming hatred of wealthy planters. He hated the Southern aristocracy with a burning passion. He grew up very poor, was self-educated, and always felt like he was looked down upon by those wealthy Southern planters sipping their tea on their rocking chairs in their giant white mansions. He absolutely despised them. And so in his restoration plan, it's a little bit more lenient than the radical Republicans, but with a twist. He is willing to grant pardons to Confederates, but not anybody with $20,000 more than property. So if you own $20,000 worth or more in property, you can't get your civil liberties back. He does this on purpose. He does it because these are the people that he hates, and these are the people that he thinks now he can turn around and stab them in the back and will get his comeuppance. He changes his tune in about 1866, 1867, because the election of 1868 is starting to come closer to the horizon. Andrew Johnson at this point is having a massive series of battles with the radical Republicans in Congress. He's very unpopular in a lot of areas. And the only way that he thinks he's going to be able to get reelection is if he readmits several of these southern states and is able to win the vote in those. And the way that he sees doing this is sort of dropping this idea of the $20,000 limit. So, in other words, he sort of starts issuing pardons in exchange for political support going forward. As you can guess, this doesn't get him any additional friends in the Republicans, and they turn against him big time. We covered the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in a previous lecture, so I'm not going to go into it here, but that is really the impetus of what starts that whole process of conflict between Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republicans, and President Johnson on the other side. The other thing that starts happening during this time period is that while Johnson is starting to affect his Reconstruction plan, because it's more lenient, he's giving control back to sometimes white majorities, sometimes actually white minorities in places like Mississippi. And they're using violence in ways to sort of try to turn back the clock. They pass what are called a series of black codes. These black codes are little more than just slavery by another name, regulating individuals on the basis of the color of their skin and trying to force the New South to look exactly like the Old South looked like. In 1866, white mobs murdered hundreds of black freedmen in New Orleans. This is replicated in multiple places throughout the South. And as I mentioned, there's a lot more information about this, but I'm not going to go into great detail onto that aspect of Reconstruction today because I want to keep things moving. So one of the things that the Republicans in Congress decide to do to try to combat what's happening in the South, to try to make sure that the New South looks different from the Old South, is they pass a series of amendments. They've already passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Now they're going to pass, and they do successfully pass, the 14th Amendment. So they pass the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment does a couple of things. What it's intended to do is make any civil rights legislation that Congress passes a requirement to the states. So previous to the 14th Amendment, anything that the federal government passed that would have applied really only to things that happened within states was something that didn't work because federalism prevented that. Federalism is the idea that states run their affairs and the federal government runs sort of an overarching affairs on top of that. The 14th Amendment makes civil rights legislation applicable to the states. And it also does another crucial thing, and that is it does what's called birth citizenship. We take this for granted in the United States today, but it's a product of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says, essentially, if you're born in the United States, then you're a citizen of the United States. Full stop. And the reason that it does this is because a lot of the black codes in the southern states were sort of taking away citizenship rights from African Americans by simply arguing that, based off of the old Dred Scott case, that as African descent, they couldn't be citizens of the United States. The 14th Amendment puts the kibosh on that and says, no, if you're born in the United States, then you are a citizen of the United States. I should point out, this is a little bit unique, even amongst Western democracies. Even amongst many Western democracies, your citizenship status goes along with the citizenship status of your parents. Only in the United States and a few other countries is your citizenship status determined by where you were born. And it was largely out of a desire to try to counteract some of the black codes that were being passed in the South that we have that today. So this starts a period of what we call Republican rule in the South. 10,000 military troops, former Union soldiers, are dispatched to all the former Confederate states. And they're there to enforce these new pieces of civil rights legislation. So this is what we call the military occupation phase of Reconstruction. It's really grounded in a couple of things. Number one is that they passed the 15th Amendment in 1870. The 15th Amendment grants the right to vote, so suffrage, to all black men in the United States. And there was a lot of hope that maybe we would extend suffrage to women at this time. Doesn't happen. That's going to come later on with the 19th Amendment. But right now, they passed the 15th Amendment, which is going to be crucial later on. The 15th Amendment grants the right to vote for all black men in the South. The rationale being that unless you granted the right to vote to former enslaved persons, they were never really going to be able to effectively participate in democracy. Congressional Reconstruction focuses around a couple of different acts, the most important of which is called the Military Reconstruction Act. The Military Reconstruction Act does a couple of things. First of all, it immediately abolishes all the white supremacist governments that cropped up during President Johnson's Reconstruction Plan and replaced them with military control over federal Confederate states. It required new state constitutions in the South to recognize black male suffrage, something that they were hesitant to do. It also puts Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union general and soon to be president, in charge of this process. Really, what they were worried about was the Republicans in Congress were worried that President Johnson would put in place someone who was not favorable to black interests, because Johnson was a horrifying racist, to put it bluntly. And to get around this, they put in place Ulysses S. Grant, who was much more forward thinking. There's a couple of other things that happen around the same time. While I should point out, while all of this is happening and while we're being very proactive towards formerly enslaved African Americans out west, things aren't quite as rosy. We're doing our best to exclude members of Chinese descent and Asian descent from entering the country. So there is kind of a flip side to the coin going on. This isn't 100% racial equality. We're still carving out exceptions as we go. The other thing that happens is there's this phenomenon known as carpet bagging that takes place. That is individuals from the North moving to the South and at the cheap buying up all these old Southern plantations, these old factories, everything, and becoming millionaires overnight. These people are called carpetbaggers, and they're resented greatly in the South. We'll see that come to fruition later on. And of course, the last thing I wanted to point out is that in Tennessee in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan is officially founded, and it will prove to be a major thorn in the side of future President Grant and other presidents all the way really through the 1920s before it finally peters out. So that brings us to President Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, a very popular general from the Civil War, wins the election of 1868, crushes it in the Electoral College, wins 214 to 80, but only wins by 300,000 in the popular vote count. So the overall vote was much, much closer. And had 500,000 African American men not voted for him in the South, who had just been granted the right for suffrage, he wouldn't have won at all. And all these men, by the way, voted in spite of great risks for themselves and for their families. One of the number one things that he tries to do throughout his early presidency is enforce the 15th Amendment. And he does this with pure military means. It's not easy. He has to go around and use his clout to try to stop things like poll taxes. Poll taxes are putting a tax on the right to cast a vote. It could be a very small amount of money, but if you are a formerly enslaved person, that probably is enough to dissuade you or make it impossible for voting. There's also things like the grandfather clause, clauses that are starting to be baked into constitutions in the South. It says, if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. So obviously this excludes people who had been enslaved previously. So a big chunk of the first 2 years of his presidency are spent just trying to enforce that 15th Amendment. Another big aspect of President Grant's 2 terms in office is his Native American policy, his Indian policy. He's actually, in terms of American presidents, one of the most forward thinking in terms of both attitude towards racial minorities and attitudes towards Native Americans. He declared sort of this period of Indian removal and conquest to be over. He believed that there needed to be more peaceful efforts at assimilation. He did think that Native Americans needed to be Western. They needed to adopt Western ways, to move to Western cities, to farm in Western ways. They had to adopt this, I'll say in quotes, hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They weren't really hunter-gatherers at this point, but that was the attitude at the time. And so he felt like they did need to assimilate, but there was going to be a lot more carrot and a lot less stick in this going forward. Does it work? Kind of. It's, if anything, a brief reprieve for Native Americans before we'll see much more aggressive efforts at assimilation later on in the 19th and early 20th century. Unfortunately, Ulysses S. Grant was not a natural politician, and he tended to be a very naive person when it came to trusting other individuals. And so his entire presidency was just racked by a series of scandals. The biggest scandal was what was called the Gould-Fisk scheme. The Gould-Fisk scheme were these 2 financiers, Gould and Fisk, trying to corner the market on gold. They hoped that they could convince Ulysses S. Grant to withhold federal reserves of gold, basically not put gold into the stream, so sort of keep money out of the economy. And by doing so, if those 2 guys bought up the majority of the gold, they would drive the price of it up because there'd be less gold in the market, which means the price of gold would go up, and then they could sell their gold at much, much, much higher prices than they bought it for. It didn't work in the end. Ulysses S. Grant and his financial advisors figure out the scheme that they're running. They end up releasing a bunch of federal reserves of gold, and a lot of people lose their shirts on the deal. In the election of 1872, Grant, this time decisively, both in the popular vote and in the electoral vote, beat Horace Greeley, who's a newspaper man from the North. A lot of people were sympathetic to a lot of the points that Greeley was making, mostly about ending the period of military reconstruction in the South. But Grant is such a popular figure that he is able to withstand the challenge and wins the election of 1872. He does consider running for a 3rd and unprecedented term in 1876, but by then the popularity has sort of waned as a result of all the scandals, and people aren't interested in seeing him again. I'm not going to talk about the election of 1876 in this lecture. That'll be a separate one, because That's the end of Reconstruction. It's a very complicated situation, very important election for American history. So I want to go into it in much greater detail later on. After the election of 1872 and the gold fisk scandal falls apart, we get what's called the Panic of 1873. Panic, remember, is just kind of the old timey word for recession or depression. So it's a huge period of economic downturn. What happens in the Panic of 1873 is this. During the Civil War, America for the first time experimented to a large extent with paper currency. It may came as a surprise to you, but even at this point in history, only about 160 years ago, people still, by and large, wanted hard currency. That's currency that includes some precious metal, gold, silver, copper, something like that. All right. So during the Civil War, however, those things are really limited. And so the United States government starts issuing paper currency called greenbacks for the first time. There is a demand after the war is over to pull those pieces of paper currency out of circulation and go back to the hard currency. Mostly, those requests come from lenders, people who lended out money during the Civil War, and now they don't want to be repaid in worthless paper money. They want to get repaid in gold and silver. And so they lobby the Grant administration to change the rules, to pull the greenbacks out of circulation, and to put the onus on all the creditors to repay everything in hard currency. Ultimately, Grant does it, pulls the greenbacks out of circulation, and all of these creditors now have to be repaid in hard currency. Problem is, of course, the people don't have hard currency. The reason that we weren't issuing hard currency, gold, silver, etc., during the Civil War is because we didn't have it. And now that all these creditors demanded to be repaid in this hard currency, it was impossible for them to do it. As a result, the people who borrowed money, they just don't pay it back. So, and this is even large company. We're talking about some railroads, some large businesses just say, we're not going to repay our debts. End of story. This pushes the nation into a financial crisis and starts a period of years, which today we would call a recession. Back then, they called a panic. That's as far as I'm going to take it in this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to get into great detail on the election of 1876, the bargain that ends Reconstruction, and the Hayes presidency.